gamba titi rekumandu tose ikorerwe nyika Zimbabwe nyika yakashongedzwa namakomo nehova zvinoyevedza ngairaimvura ngaipembesa vashandi vatuswe ruzhinji rukudzwe ngaikorerwe nyika yeZimbabwe. Mwariro pafadzai nyika yeZimbabwe, nyika yamadzitateguru edu tose, kubva Zambezi kusvika Limpopo navatungamiri vave nenduramo nyika yeZimbabwe.
Good evening, everybody. Good evening and welcome to this evening's installment of CrossOvr, the Grace Bridge. And yes, indeed, that is such a beautiful rendition of music, the Zimbabwean national anthem as delivered by our very own Rifi Wacho, the sound sangoma himself, a guy I'm proud to call a friend and a brother, and he is on the call. So yeah, those of you who want to shout out, please shout out to Rifi for that beautiful piece of music, which he has also kindly allowed us to use for today's session. Before we get into the details and what we're discussing today, maybe we should start with a word of prayer. And for that, who shall I ask to pray for us today? Tatenda Sibanda. Masibanda, if you could please pray for us.
Let us pray. Our Father who is in heaven, we'd like to thank you so much for bringing us here this evening. We want to ask you to be with the speaker this evening and just touch him in a special way and send a message through him. I pray all these things to Christ, my Lord and Savior. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much, Tatenda. So for those of you who are joining us for the very first time, we are CrossOvr the Grace Bridge. We are a community of predominantly young millennial Christians, but we are a very open community. We like to engage not just in spiritual, theological, and biblical topics, but also contemporary topics that affect our material lives, because we understand that as Christians, we're not just concerned, or God is not just concerned with our spirituality, but with the materiality of the conditions that we experience in our lives on earth and those of our fellow brothers and sisters. And I guess that leads us very nicely into today's topic, which we've decided to entitle Quiet Diplomacy, When Silence Breeds Apathy. And I guess where the wording of that topic came from was in obviously seeing, I think we are quite familiar with the hashtag, which has been gaining momentum since the 31st of July, when Zimbabweans once again decided to take to the streets to protest for their human rights, which is really a basic human right, as Stumo would have said earlier on today. So that's where it came from, basically. And the question basically that we're trying to answer today, or some of the questions we want to answer, is, should something be said about the Zimbabwean crisis? If something should be said, what should be said, and who should be saying it? Whose responsibility is it to speak? And those are some of the questions that we want to grapple with today. And we have found none other than Jamie the Rinza Mighty himself today to come and opine on these issues. And those of you who know Jamie, obviously a Twitter sensation, some of you may know him as, and he's known as the Rinza for some of the controversial rinsing episodes that he has been involved in. There are several victims of his rinsing who are well known on the Twitter streets. So Jamie, please don't rinse me today. Let's just rinse the topic of what's happening in Zimbabwe, so that we all leave here with a bit of illumination about how we could engage with this, with the struggle, what the responsibility of each and every one of us is in waging the struggle and the war for human rights in Zimbabwe. And yeah, without any further ado, welcome to CrossOvr, Jamie. We've been waiting for you, and yeah, the floor is yours. Share with us what you've got to say.
Thanks for having me. Just thumbs up if the sound is okay, Spoo. I think I'll use your reference point. Okay, yeah, great. Thanks, Farai, as well. Just going to start my timer and jump straight into it. So I think I'm going to start off by giving a quick history lesson just to bring everyone up to speed with the context and the history of Zimbabwe as quickly as I can. Now, I'm not a historian. I studied law at Wits University. I only did history in high school, but I've tried to piece together a timeline that I think will assist you in getting to the bottom of the timeline of the Zimbabwean story and how we get to the Zimbabwean Lives Matter moment. So fundamentally, the British South Africa Company, which was a company started by Cecil John Rhodes, came in with a bunch of settlers into the Zimbabwean territory, which was then demarcated as Rhodesia. So they came in and they basically started mining, taking over land. And in the 1800s, in 1896, there was what is called the first Chimurenga, or the first liberation struggle. So the first Chimurenga occurs between 1896 and 1897. And it was led by spiritual leaders from the Shona tribes, as well as certain chiefs. So two prominent spiritual leaders who led this are Sekuru Kagui and Mbuya Nehanda. So if you listen to some Zimbabwean music, you'll hear references to Sekuru Kagui and Mbuya Nehanda, and they were spiritual leaders. And then you had a few chiefs who were paramount at the time and critical to that first struggle. You had Chief Mashaya Mombe, Chief Mondoro, and Chaminuka as well as one of the leaders who was taking part in this first Chimurenga. It was not a successful venture because obviously they didn't have superior weapons. There was still a lot of contestation. You see, what we refer to colloquially as Shona is a group of tribes that speak a similar language, different dialects, but it's not a monolithic entity. So there wasn't a lot of unity around the first Chimurenga. There was still the kind of internal contestations that you would frequently see. So the British had superior weapons. There was a bit of division. By the way, at that time, there was a massive drought as well as a massive disease that infested the cows. And basically the spiritual leaders were like, this is because the whites are here. we need to kill the whites and get rid of them. So they even traveled to Matabeleland, where the Ndebele group of tribes lives. So you've basically got two major divisions, Matabeleland and Mashonaland, based on the group of tribes that live there. So Mbuyane Handa and Sekuru Kaguvi actually tried to recruit the whole nation to be part of this first Chimurenga. It was not successful. In 1923, the British formally annexed Southern Rhodesia and put it under the control of Britain. So from 1923, it was a proper British colony. Some of the rules that they imposed, though, did envision that it would be a normal system of voting and it wouldn't be a racially divided system. But the laws that were designed such that the only people who could vote had property, were paying a certain amount of tax, etc., etc. So the system was still such exclusively that blacks were excluded from voting. So obviously, because of the first Chimurenga, there was already a lot of sentiments which were anti-colonial from the very beginning, and people were aware of these sentiments. We fast forward the story a little bit, and we introduce a character known as Joshua Nkomo. Joshua Nkomo is under-discussed in some circles because a lot of people just know Mugabe, but I'll introduce you to him. Joshua Nkomo was a young man at the age of 25. He travels to Johannesburg to study carpentry and to study social work. While he's in Johannesburg, he meets Oliver Tambo, Nelson Mandela, around about the time when they were forming the ANC Youth League. So these are his friends, they're his colleagues, they have debates. He lives in Johannesburg for a period of 5 years, from 1942 up until 1947. He then returns to Southern Rhodesia and actually forms the African National Congress in Rhodesia. So as far as he was concerned, he was creating a chapter of the African National Congress, another branch, so to speak, in Southern Rhodesia. That's how close the connection was. Interestingly enough, a lot of people don't appreciate that the South African, the Zimbabwean, the Zambian, the Malawian stories are all interlinked, and they're interlinked through this man, Celsus John Rhodes, through this company, the British South Africa Company. So there's going to be a lot of interplay, and there continues to be till this day, as you can see. But this is where it comes from. The events that are unfolding are still very much linked to the original mandate, which was, or the corruption that occurred under colonialism. So Nkomo comes in, founds the African National Congress. They rename it at some point to the Southern Rhodesian African National Congress. There's some events that happen in the 50s, which are not really that important to discuss, but ultimately everybody then comes together to form this one party, which they call the National Democratic Party. And that party gets banned in 1960. So almost as soon as it was formed, it gets banned. Joshua Nkomo then forms a new organization in 1961. That organization was called the Zimbabwean African People's Union, ZAPU. So ZAPU is a name some of you may have heard. It was the first strong and long-lasting political entity formed. So this is when we start getting into the period that many refer to as the second Chimurenga, the second organized attempt to remove white colonial rule from Zimbabwe. In 1963, the entity that is known as ZAPU splits up into two formations. One remains as ZAPU under the leadership of Joshua Nkomo. Other prominent names are Dumiso Ndabengwa, Lookout Masugu, Jason Ziapapa Moyo. All of these remain in ZAPU. But other leaders who were in ZAPU have a disagreement with the Nkomo faction, and they form a new organization. And that organization is called the Zimbabwe African National Union, which is ZANU. So now you have the two actors that you may have heard of across the time, ZAPU and ZANU. And shortly thereafter, all of these leaders, most of them, are actually arrested. They are arrested and they are incarcerated for a period of 10 years. But while they are under arrest, the war begins. And this war is called the Rhodesian Bush War. So each of the entities actually had a military wing, the same way that Umkhonto weSizwe was the military wing of the ANC. So ZAPU had a military wing called ZIPRA, which stands for the Zimbabwean People's Revolutionary Army. And then ZANU had an army as well, which was called the Zimbabwean African National Liberation Army. So ZIPRA has one army, ZANU has another army. The interesting thing about these armies is that they got a lot of support as a result of the Cold War. If you remember, the Cold War started in 1947 and went all the way up until 1991. The Cold War was this proxy war that occurred between Russia, America, China, as a result of this contestation for global power. So they didn't fight directly because, of course, everyone had nuclear weapons and they were scared of each other. So what they did is they would fight in all of these outposts. A lot happened in Africa. Some other countries where the Cold War affected were DRC. If you look at Angola, you'll find that the connotations of the Cold War were directly affecting the politics of those regions. So the Soviet Union, what we now call Russia, supplied weapons to Joshua Nkomo. And Joshua Nkomo's approach was that he was going to run a professional military army and wage a military modern war against the Rhodesian army. The ZAPU side wanted to hold a guerrilla war. So the ZAPU army, ZANLA, got support from China, from North Korea, from Ethiopia, and they were based predominantly in Mozambique. And the ZAPU army, ZIPRA, was based predominantly in Zambia. So they would fight ZAPU predominantly in Matabeleland, and ZANLA would fight predominantly in Mashonaland. In these particular fights, this is where some of the tensions, tribal tensions, started to emerge. Because when the parties split at the beginning, the split was not about tribe. It was about military strategy. One group wanted to be aggressive, the other group wanted to be moderate. So ZIPRA wanted an aggressive war, and ZANLA wanted a moderate approach to dealing with the problem, and they split. They all eventually got to the same destination, which was you need to fight the war. But ZANLA took a longer time to reach that destination than ZIPRA did. ZIPRA was willing to do that from the beginning. So what you then see is you have a period of a Rhodesian bush war, which goes on for 15 years. 15 years, 5 months, 1 week, and 1 day, to be specific. So that war goes on for that long. And as the war is unfolding, there's contestation between the ZIPRA forces and the ZANLA forces, because some of the people began to appreciate that whoever is the dominant army at the end and whoever wins will actually have the upper hand at the point of independence. So there was a Game of Thrones element to this. And Mugabe was with ZANU and Nkomo was with ZAPU. In 1974, everyone gets released from prison, the political leaders. So Joshua Nkomo goes back to join the ZAPU side, and Mugabe goes back to join the ZIPRA side in Mozambique. An interesting thing that I don't think I mentioned, but I think it's important to point out, in Zambia, in Lusaka, you had Umkhonto weSizwe, you had ZAPU, you had the ZIPRA forces who were fighting, and all of these people were living in the same spaces. They were sharing resources. They were all getting military training from the same people. The Soviet Union, the East Germans, they were getting some military training in that capacity. So the relationship that exists between Umkhonto weSizwe and ZIPRA is actually a very strong relationship. Some of these guys were sharing rooms, some of them were tents or wherever they were sleeping. I'm not sure where they were sleeping, so let me not presume sleeping arrangements, but they were in the same spaces. All of these cadres were all in the same areas. But as you can see, Umkhonto weSizwe was in Zambia, but the forces of Mugabe were in Mozambique. So Mugabe didn't really have a strong relationship or connection with the South African freedom fighters. And he also viewed them as being overly sympathetic to somebody that he viewed as a rival for power. That was Joshua Nkomo. So in 1974, everyone goes back. Mugabe actually was not the dominant leader within the ZAPU the ZANU contingent. He was a prominent leader, but there were others above him. Herbert Chitepo was not imprisoned when everyone else was in jail. So he was the guy who was running all of the operations of ZANU. And then there were two other guys. One was called Josiah Tongogara, and another guy was called Solomon Mujuru. Josiah Tongogara and Solomon Mujuru were in charge of the ZANLA army, the ZANU army. So in fact, when Mugabe came back, many people didn't want him in Mozambique. And then Solomon Mujuru had to negotiate and plead on Mugabe's behalf that he must be allowed to join the people within the barracks, the people who had actually been fighting. He was viewed as a nerdy outsider. It's an interesting side story. In 1975, Herbert Chitepo was assassinated. They are contesting reports, but it does seem as if he was assassinated by the Rhodesians, although Kenneth Kaunda, the president of Zambia, commissioned an investigation, and his investigation found that Herbert Chitepo was actually killed by ZANU-PF operatives. But it seems as if there was a confession from one of the old Rhodesians that they were the ones who killed Herbert Chitepo. So Herbert Chitepo was now dead. The people who were now left running were Josiah Tongogara, Solomon Mujuru, Robert Mugabe, and in 1979, Josiah Tongogara was killed in a car accident, quote unquote. There's contestation over how he died. Many people say that he was actually killed, and some of the reports around the people who saw him say that rather than actually having car accident wounds, he actually had gunshot wounds, and he was killed by ZANU people. And the theory goes that it was Mugabe, Solomon Mujuru, Emerson Mnangagwa who actually removed Josiah Tongogara because Josiah Tongogara wanted to work with Joshua Nkomo in the new dispensation. He was trying to create a unitary structure where you would have ZANU and ZAPU coming together. But Mugabe wasn't a fan of that because he thought that it would be giving the ZAPU guys the spoils of the war that he rightfully thought should go to ZANU. So there was an attempt to create what was called a patriotic front. The patriotic front was supposed to be this army, which included ZANLA and ZIPRA together. But it never really took off, but the idea existed. So after independence, Mugabe was very worried about the grouping around Nkomo, ZAPU, because remember, ZAPU had a sophisticated army. At some point, they had tanks, jets, and they had a lot of equipment. And some of that equipment was never handed back to the Zimbabwean army because, you know, when independence is attained, everyone is supposed to give in their guns, etc., etc. But guns were not necessarily given in. So what Mugabe then said was that he was going to get rid of what he termed the dissidents. He said that these guys are dissidents, they are not really cooperating with us, and we need to get rid of them. So he used a brigade that was called the 5th Brigade, a special military elite unit that was trained in North Korea. And basically they went across Matabeleland, killing young people and trying to, you know, find the guns and find the dissidents, find the people who were fighting for ZIPRA so that they wouldn't be a military threat towards ZANU. And that's why you had the killings. But because the way the guerrilla war went, the Rhodesian Bush War, people used to recruit young people, and people were worried within the ZANU-PF camp that if young men are still alive, they will join ZAPU, they will join Nkomo, and then you will have a strong contestation for your power by somebody who still has guns. So that's why you see that Kukurahundi period unfolding, because it was an attempt by Mugabe to consolidate all of the power, and he tried to brand the ZAPU activists as dissidents, as people who were trying to destabilize the state, and that was not necessarily true. So that's how you get the Kukurahundi, and the war basically continued, this war that Mugabe had, the internal war, up until the point where Joshua Nkomo made a peace deal with Mugabe, and then you had the formation which was now called the ZANU-PF, PF standing for Patriotic Front. So under the ZANU-PF, Joshua Nkomo then became the vice president of Zimbabwe, and then the tensions were now considered to have been closed down. In all of that, you still had the land question, which was unfolding. So between 1980 and 1990, there was a moratorium which was set on any form of aggressive land reform. This is because an agreement signed, which was called, the Lancaster House Agreement. So in 1990, the first condition of the Lancaster House Agreement passed, and Zimbabwe changed its land reform policy, and they started implementing a more aggressive land reform policy. And Britain had made an agreement that they would pay for half of the what you call this, half of the cost of the land. And they had been doing that from 1980 up until 1990 in a willing buyer, willing seller model. Now, in the second dispensation, the land reform process, which was chosen, was one which was chosen under what was called the Zimbabwean Land Acquisition Act of 1992. Under that Land Acquisition Act of 1992, Zimbabwe started procuring a more aggressive land reform policy. The land was supposed to go to the people, but more and more, it turned out that the land was going to well-connected members of the ZANU-PF. And then Britain started having problems with this and started complaining. Similarly, in the early 90s, you had a drought, two droughts actually, and Zimbabwe was not in a good economic condition. So under all of these things, a group of people started making a lot of noise. That group of people was called the war veterans. The war veterans then started saying, we want to be compensated for having fought in the war. We didn't get land, we didn't get jobs, we want to be compensated. A gentleman called Chenjerai Hunzwi, who used to refer to himself as Hitler, he actually became the chairperson of the War Veterans Association in 1997. And that's when everything hit the fan, so to speak, because in 1997, they started to aggressively push for compensation for war veterans. And Mugabe gave in to the demands of the war veterans, and a lump sum was guaranteed to all war veterans, a lump sum which was the equivalent of about 2,500 US dollars. So every war veteran got that amount of money. And the World Bank and the IMF actually then said, listen, we're not enthusiastic about this. We've been supporting you guys. You've had these two droughts. You're in a tight economic situation. Where are you going to get the money to pay these war veterans, to give them all of the benefits that you're promising them? Mugabe said, we're going to borrow the money. And then they said, well, you're not going to borrow it from us. In the same year, later on, after Tony Blair had just come in as the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom under a Labour ticket, he reneged on the Lancaster House Agreement of paying 50% for the land reform. So these two events, the payment of the war veterans of a lump sum, as well as the pull out, so to speak, of the UK from the Lancaster House Agreement, created market anxiety and panic. And then an event called Black Friday occurred in Zimbabwe. Black Friday was on the 14th of November in 1997. And basically on that day, 70% of the Zimbabwean currency lost value to the US dollar. So 70% of the value was wiped out. Zimbabwe lost most of its value on that one day. The markets collapsed. The stock market was not stable, and the foreign currency reserves of the state of Zimbabwe were depleted. After that, the mayhem accelerated. And what we then saw in 98, 99, leading up to 2000, were more protests, a new political party coming out, which was very strong. That was called the Movement for Democratic Change. So then you have these elections, which were supposed to happen in 2002. Those elections were basically rigged by the ZANU-PF regime, because Mugabe was under immense pressure and people were of the view that he's just going to lose the election. Now everything is in free fall. Land reform is accelerated. The land grabs are happening because Chenjerai Hunzwi, the guy I referred to earlier, has become emboldened. They're going into the farms, they're taking farms. So all of this is causing all of the global panic that you may be familiar with. And there's hyperinflation, there are fuel shortages, there is a mass exodus of people at the same time. And in 2008, there's another election which is supposed to happen. This election happens, Morgan Tsvangirai and the MDC win the first round. According to some of the reports, and I think these reports are credible, Morgan Tsvangirai actually won by enough of a majority to prevent a second round of the race. But unfortunately, the numbers were manipulated. There were delays in announcement. And when it was announced, Morgan Tsvangirai had the majority, but he hadn't crossed over the line. So there had to be a second second round, a runoff between him and Mugabe. And there was a lot of violence that eventually happened, and Morgan Tsvangirai subsequently pulled out of the second stage of the election. And then the international community came together, tried to make them do a power sharing deal, and Mugabe agreed, but he made sure that all the power remained in his hands and not in Tsvangirai's hands. And Tsvangirai basically left the government of national unity within a year. At that point, all of the chaos had ensued in Zimbabwe. There was now a culture of political repression. There was now a culture of oppression of free speech. There was now a culture of all of the mess that you may be familiar with. And then in 2017, you have that moment where the coup happens, where Mugabe tries to get Grace to come in with her faction G40, and then the military guys are unhappy with that. They squirrel or spirit away Emerson Mnangagwa. They do what they did, they bring him back, and then he ascends to the presidency. Some people were of the view that Emerson Mnangagwa is going to be a different character, but Emerson Mnangagwa was with Robert Mugabe from day one. And as you can see, he has continued with the tactics that he has been imposing. So basically, what you now have seen in Zimbabwe is three things. Number one, the army is used for enforcement at every level. Number two, there's a sophisticated intelligence operation that operates in Zimbabwe. They operate in Zimbabwe, but also in South Africa, in Zambia, anywhere where there are large pockets of Zimbabwean nationals, you can rest assured there are some intelligence operatives there. Even at the universities, WITS, UJ, UCT, Rhodes, and Fort Hare, some of the people who register there as students are actually working as intelligence operatives to keep an eye on the intellectuals and the intelligentsia of Zimbabwe to make sure that they are not trying to organize outside of the country. So that's what basically has been happening. If you try to express an opinion that is anti the government, there will be consequences, especially if you're within the territory. There definitely will be consequences. If you are trying to organize protests, marches, whatever the case may be, there will be consequences for that. So what we saw this year is Hopewell Chinono actually was able to expose a massive COVID corruption scandal worth 1 billion rands. The government of Zimbabwe, the Minister of Health at the time, Obadiah Moyo, was working with this guy who was very close to the president. They opened a new company, they got this massive tender, and then they tried to deposit some of the money overseas. When they tried to deposit some of the money overseas in a new bank account, it automatically alerts Interpol. So Interpol then started inquiring in Zimbabwe, hey, what is this money? How is this company now depositing $2 million US in an overseas bank account that was opened a few months ago? And that information obviously ended up in the hands of journalists. They exposed the corruption. The tender was allocated very irregularly. And the Minister of Health was actually arrested. Sorry, excuse me, I'm speaking a bit too fast. The Minister of Health was arrested and he was discharged without even going into the cells. He was granted bail and he's still out on bail as things stand right now. So Hopewell Chinono was then arrested a few weeks after, and the government said they were arresting him because he was inciting violence by reporting on protests which were being planned. The protests which were being planned by a gentleman known as Jacob Ngarivume. He's one of these opposition entities in Zimbabwe. So he was saying there must be an anti-corruption march, human rights march on the 31st of July. So the government basically arrested anybody who said that they were going to participate in that march, who was reporting on that march, and they basically tried to make sure that that march didn't happen. And as you saw on Friday, it definitely didn't happen. They were arresting young people for protesting outside of their gates. They arrested Tsitsi Dangarembwa, who's a prominent novelist. She wrote the book Never's Conditions. They arrested Fadzai Mahere, who is the spokesperson of the MDC Alliance right now, and she was protesting in her neighborhood with a small group of people. The reason why they did that, I think, is important. I'm going to conclude there and then we can have the discussion, because I've tried to summarize a lot and I'm sure there's many things that I've left out. And if I've made a mistake somewhere technical, I apologize. But last year, we saw protests happening in Algeria and Sudan. the protests in Sudan were actually triggered by an increase in the price of bread and the removal of a fuel levy. Now, the reason why the fuel went up in Sudan is because South Sudan has a lot of the oil, and Sudan no longer had the same access to oil that they used to have before the split of Sudan into two countries, Sudan and South Sudan. So when the price of fuel went up, people started protesting. And those protests started to become anti-government protests in February. By April, Omar al-Bashir had to step down, and then the army then tried to take over, and the people resisted the army taking over in Sudan. They stayed on the streets. The army tried to kill them in the month of June. And then what happened was the international community stood in solidarity. If you remember, everyone was putting blue circles on their Instagram and tweeting about Sudan. Last year, Rihanna, Lupita, everybody. So because of the international community pressure, the people of Sudan and the army saw that they couldn't impose their will on the people. And then now Sudan is actually run by a mix of the military and the civilian government. And actually the army is actually being pushed out of that civilian government progressively. And now, as you know, Omar al-Bashir is being taken to the ICC. So that's what happened last year when protests happened in Sudan. In Algeria, they also protested. And the reason why they protested was because the president, Abdelaziz Bouteflika, was trying to run for a 5th term of office. And the irony is he was trying to run for a 5th term, but he was actually so disabled that he was unable to appear in public for 5 years because he had had a stroke. So, but he was trying to run again, or the people around him were trying to get him to run again. And the youth of Algeria said, no, you can't run again for a 5th term. You've been in charge for 20 years. Now you want to be in charge for 25 years. And you are sick. We haven't even seen you do a live address for 5 years. You haven't been seen in public. You haven't been seen in parliament. You haven't been seen anywhere. So in Algeria, they protested as well, and Bouteflika had to step down. So it's clear that being aware of not only the Sudanese protests, the Algerian protests, but also the Hong Kong protests, that, and even now, as you may not know, but there are protests that are happening in Mali, where people are protesting, and it's because there was some manipulation of the results of the parliamentary elections, which were held just earlier this year. So there are protests that have been happening in Mali, and the government has now been forced to make many concessions that they were not willing to make. But the protesters actually want the president to step down. So if you are the ZANU-PF High Guard, and you are seeing all of these events, especially under COVID-19, you're going to be a little bit nervous that if people actually protest, you're not going to be able to stop that protest, and it's going to be the end of your regime, your power. And this is why they were so harsh in how they responded to the activists, the protesters, because they don't want anybody to march, because they are scared that if anybody marches, it's going to be Sudan, it's going to be Algeria, it's going to be Mali. And because they can't shut down the internet anymore, that protest may grow. Last year, there was a protest that happened at the beginning of 2019, and that protest was about fuel increases and just the normal stuff that has been happening in Zimbabwe. But as a result of the way that the government responded to it, they were able to kill the protest, basically. In January, the government shut down the internet. They killed 17 people. 17 women were confirmed as having been victims of rape at the hands of the army. And basically, the army was going into people's homes, finding activists, abducting them, giving them the beating of their lives. And basically, that's how they killed that particular protest. But because they shut down the internet, there was a global condemnation around that. And they eventually had to open the internet. But by the time the internet was back, they had already killed the protest. But now, because they've done it before, they can't do it again. So now they have to use other measures, right? And that's why you saw the response that played out last week and even this week. So this is what has led to this moment where people are now saying Zimbabwean lives matter, because basically you have a situation where investigative journalists cannot do their work. You've got a situation where activists cannot do their work. You've got a situation where opposition parties cannot do their work, which is to oppose, to critique, to organize around and try to create an alternative to the dominant party. To compare it with South Africa, Pete Rampedi and Polly Van Wyk are credited for having done extensive investigative journalism, one in respect to VBS and the other in respect to this Royal Bata scandal that has implicated the president's spokesperson, Kusela Diko. None of them were arrested for that investigative journalism. In fact, investigative journalism on the arms deal, on several other corruption scandals, Sarafina too, whichever one you want to go to, there's never been a culture of arresting investigative journalists in this country, because the democracy, whether it's America, UK, whatever, investigative journalists do what they do, and you live with the consequences as the ruling party. Same way that Julius Malema can call Cyril Ramaphosa a bastard, which is what I think he did. Excuse, I know it's a church group, but Julius did that, and he wasn't arrested because it's not a criminal offense to do that. But if you were to do anything similar to that in Zimbabwe, you are definitely not going to see the end of the day, because that's how difficult it is to express yourself. Now, if you look at protest culture, protest is important. Protest is what led to the civil rights movement in America. It's what led to the independence of the Indians when they were doing the SALT protest. Protest is so important that it's a protected right, not only in many constitutions, but at the UN level and also at the African Charter for Human and People's Rights. So these are constitutional things that are protected. You know, in a democracy, you've got three ways of practicing the democracy. You can either express yourself and organize politically. You can also be part of the media and critique, or you can actually protest in between elections. So all of those things are important for a democracy, but they haven't happened in this particular situation. So if you were to contrast the Zimbabwean moment with everything that happens in South Africa, with protests even during COVID-19, unions, the Black Lives Matter protest that happened just now when people went to the US Embassy in Sandton, that just shows you the difference in terms of freedom and oppression. And just to conclude, I think many people were very alarmed and scared by the president's comments that he will flush out the bad apples, you know, because he didn't take any responsibility. He merely said that all of the opinions which were being aired were as the result of foreign actors, which is a common ZANU-PF defense. But the reality is the hashtag came out of Zimbabwe. The people who started speaking about this issue came out of Zimbabwe. But of course, there is a limited voice on the Zimbabwean issue. And as a result, the international community has been trying to close that gap. But it's going to be difficult to get freedom for Zimbabwean people based on what everything that I've just told you, basically. So I'm going to leave it there, and then we'll open up for questions. I don't know how it's going to work. I think, Spoo, you're going to moderate that.
Thank you very much, Jamie. Thank you so much. That was such an elegant and detailed narration in such a short space of time of the history that Zimbabwe comes from. And I think we should be kind to you because you did give a caveat that there may be technical details that you might have missed. So if you want to challenge Jamie on technical issues, let's be kind to him. This was a lot of content to cover in such a short space of time. So thank you very much for that. And I also probably need to put out a caveat that I missed about 10 minutes of your talk because I was having connectivity issues on my side, but I came back. So I'm hoping the sophistication of that Zimbabwean intelligentsia you're speaking about does not reach as far as my connectivity in my house.
Yeah, let's hope it's not that.
Yeah, let's hope it's not that. But I think I got the gist of what you shared with us this evening. So guys, I'm about to kickstart this conversation, and I could go on all night with the conversation, engaging Jamie on this topic because it's a topic that's very close to my heart. So if you guys don't come into the chats with your questions, with your comments, you don't put up your hand, I'm happy to have this as a dialogue between myself and Jamie because I'm very passionate about this topic. But having said that, we do acknowledge that this is a very sensitive topic, and Jamie has already said it's not a joke that that issues of speaking out are very serious in terms of potential repercussions. So if you want to remain anonymous in the questions that you ask, please do so by sending your question directly to myself and just through the private chat functionality, send it to myself or to the CrossOvr account and just indicate anonymous, and we will read your question anonymously. But otherwise, we're all encouraged to engage in the topic. So there's a lot to unpack, Jamie, and I think one of the first things I would want to talk about, and everyone else is free to bring up your talking points. I think what is it about? Is there something about the DNA of liberation movements? Because you spoke about the amount of time that they spent, MK, Zipra, Zanla, and how, I mean, a lot of us didn't actually know, I mean, just how, just the relationships and the networks that exist and just how closely knit these liberation movements are. Is there something about the DNA which, speaking about, because there's been a lot of criticism against the ANC, specifically our president, Cyril Ramaphosa, about their silence on the subject of Zimbabwe, and which is a human rights crisis. And this doesn't just start with Ramaphosa. You go back to the Zuma years, you go back to the Mbeki years. Our government has always held the tone of Zimbabwe must be allowed, Zimbabwe is a sovereign state, they must be allowed self-determination. We run the risk of becoming a Britain whom Mugabe famously said to in the person of Gordon Brown at the time, Gordon Brown, keep your Great Britain and I'll keep my Zimbabwe. And the Mbekis, I mean, that has been the tone basically from ANC leaders through the years to say, we don't want to get involved in the issues of Zimbabwe. So is it necessarily meddling for South African leaders to get involved with a very strong hand, basically, of speaking out against the human rights abuses? Is it meddling, or is there a need for very strong intervention from neighboring states? And what is the role of, as I said when I started, that DNA of liberation parties, the relationships they've had? Oh, sorry, someone just corrected me. It wasn't Gordon Brown, it was Tony Blair. I do actually think that he's said it more than once. He said it about both Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, but I stand under correction. So what is it? I mean, what is the relationship between all those factors? The silence of our leaders here in South Africa, the relationship that they have dating back to the struggle days as liberation parties. What is it about that liberation party DNA that makes, is this a case of no honor among thieves, for lack of a better expression? What are your views on that?
Well, I think that there is this loyalty that exists because of the relationships that were formed in the struggle period. You know, even though Mugabe was not necessarily a fan of the ANC, there were many people who understood and supported, even in New Era Zimbabwe. And as a result, there were also many South Africans who were living in Zimbabwe in the 80s. Some people forget those elements, that many people actually were in exile here just as citizens. They didn't want to fight. They didn't want to like be part of the war. They just thought, let me be part of this new country, because who knows when the Afrikaners are going to give us freedom. So some people escaped just to become just people, you know. Some people came to learn, etc., etc. So the relationships that exist with the older generation, they seem to all stem from this period in time where basically they were all on the same campus. And now you're asking them to like betray their friend, some guy that maybe he was sharing, you know, a tent with, or they were eating together. Maybe they you know, they used to go and look for girls together. You never know what they were doing together, right? Because they were in Lusaka together. Some of these guys were in Mozambique together. And as a result, the relationships in the region are very much of brotherhood. They're all fighting the white man. So that's one. Number two is the issues of Zimbabwe are tricky because Mugabe was doing two things. One, he was fighting his people, and two, he was fighting white people, right? And the fight towards white people was this fight for land, this fight around neo-colonialism and outside influence. And that fight was actually a legitimate fight in many instances. But because of that fight, people were ignoring some of the other issues around Mugabe. So at the beginning, the Western world ignored Gukurahundi because they were just like, let's give this guy a chance. He's killing other blacks. He says it's political. Let's leave it. So they didn't care about black lives. And it's only when Mugabe started coming for them that all of a sudden they remembered that he had done a Gukurahundi. All of a sudden they cared about that. But some people were raising it from the beginning to say, look what he's doing to black people. He's going to do it to everybody because this is how he rolls. But at the time, people were like Margaret Thatcher, all of these people, they ignored it because they were like, no, let's give him a chance. So in the fight with the enemy of the West, a lot of the African states focused on that and gave him a pass on the fight internally, because Mugabe was very draconian at the beginning. He wanted to have a one-party state. He said that having opposition parties was a luxury. So what he wanted was a one-party state. And many of the liberation movements believe in one-party entities, which is why I think a certain president at some point was like, let me be a dictator for a short period of time. Let me just sort out what I need to sort out, and then I'll give you back the democracy. But there's always been this romanticization of a one-party state, partly because of the relationships with Russia, with China. So people have said, but this works, this is our allies, this is what we're always trying to accomplish. We're never trying to be like these Western countries. We're trying to be like Soviet Union. We're trying to be like China. We're trying to be like Cuba. These were our allies. These were the groups that we were working with. This is who we admired. But now, when you now look at the issue outside of that romanticization and the ignoring, I think the reality is the Old Boys Club does not really meet their obligation in the way that they're supposed to, because the principle of sovereignty is one that does apply, but it's not an absolute principle. You cannot claim sovereignty even when you are abusing human rights, even when a lot is happening. And in fact, many times countries do not claim sovereignty. When countries are looking for disaster relief, right? Whether it's cyclones, last year we had some cyclones, Cyclone Idai, and I can't remember the second one. But when those cyclones hit, Zimbabwean leaders didn't claim sovereignty. They didn't say, look, don't give us money, we're a sovereign state. They appreciated that the outside can help in a time of disaster, right? The same is true of COVID-19 now. When Jack Ma was offering that PPE, everybody took the PPE. They didn't say, this is Chinese interference. The Chinese are trying to influence our government. So the concept of sovereignty cannot be selectively applied, right? And when we now think about the limits of that concept, democracy and, in fact, all kinds of modern history have been about the civilians. The civilians are the most important actor. So your sovereignty is not for you as Robert Mugabe, as Emerson Mnangagwa. It's there for the people, so that the people's aspirations are not frustrated by outside forces. So if the people vote for a particular entity and this is the mandate they want to run, it's about them. But now if you have an elite group, a military group, oppressing those people, suppressing those people, that concept of sovereignty is not one that they can use as a shield. And I use the metaphor, I say, if somebody is beating their wife next door, right, and they're beating their children, at what point do you disregard that you are a neighbor and you don't live in that house? People like to say or whatever, but that is actually how we got into the situation where there's rampant domestic violence, because people will hear a woman screaming next door and leave it rather than calling the police, rather than trying to make sure that she's safe, right? The reality is no one morally accepts. And I think from a Christian perspective, the standard that exists is that of the Good Samaritan, right? You don't walk past someone when they're in that position of suffering. If and how you can, you do what you can. I don't think that the story was about this guy was rich and therefore he did it and took. I think Jesus used that example, but it wasn't really about he took him to this fancy place and gave him this luxurious treatment. I think it was about he stopped and he helped with what he could to make sure that that guy didn't die on the side of the road. Now, when it comes now to this idea that there's this sovereignty principle and cannot be breached, I think that argument is disingenuous, because you do have in the African Charter for Human and People's Rights a recognition that people can organize to remove a government. People can actually fight a war to remove an oppressive regime, and it's recognized as a legitimate right. That regime cannot say, no, but we're sovereign. Why are these people doing this? Because there's a recognition that some states can become bad, some states can become draconian, and some states can become entities that act against their own people. And arguably, the ZANU-PF military complex has been in that shape for a very long period of time. Some would say from Kukurahundi. In fact, when Joshua Nkomo was running for president in that 1980 election, he told people not to vote for Idi Amin. And people asked him, what do you mean don't vote for Idi Amin? He said, if you look at what is being done here, there are multiple instances where Robert Mugabe has been acting like Idi Amin. And this is something that's not discussed much, but there was a lot of violence in the rural areas in the 1980 election. In fact, when Zimbabwe became a new state, there was a general who was called Peter Walls. He was a white guy who was coming from the Rhodesian army. He left the army, right, a few months into 1980. And one of the reasons why he left is because he actually tried to raise the flag about electoral violence that had happened in various parts of the country, which was executed by Zanla forces under the instruction of Mugabe. So he was of the viewpoint that the 1980 election itself was a violent election, one which was not supposed to be recognized. So he actually complained to Margaret Thatcher. He complained to a few people saying, this election is not a free and fair election. You guys must intervene. And they refused. So by the end of 1980, he had actually left the Rhodesian army, and then Solomon Mujuru then became the commander of the Rhodesian army. So if you think about it, for some, this idea that we're sovereign, leave us, is one which keeps treating Zimbabwe as a private property of ZANU-PF elites and not the property of the people. And that's what it should be. And even now, when they say this, they are actually the ones operating outside of the constitution. So they're not within a constitutional mandate when they arrest protesters, when they arrest investigative journalists, which is why sometimes they'll try to create a sham of taking the journalists to court. But if you look at this, Hopewell Chinono has been to court, I think 4 times now. He's been denied bail every time because they keep saying that, well, if we release him on bail, he'll go onto Twitter and start tweeting. But the guy who was directly implicated in the corruption scandal, the former Minister of Health, he got bail the same day. He didn't even go into the prison. So now that doesn't reflect a fair regime there.
Yeah. No, I got you. And I think, I mean, there has been a question about the role of, I think I saw a question from Candy Moyo about diplomacy, that diplomacy is not done merely bilaterally, but we work as regions with the involvement. Okay, so the question is, how can SADC get involved in helping the Zimbabweans solve the crisis? And we've got quite a bit of questions. So Jamie, I'm going to ask you to try and be a bit more succinct.
I'll try to keep it brief.
So that we can.
So let's go one by one. Which one? Just read it out, because I may have missed some. I'm trying to read the comment section, but there's also chats. So I'm not sure.
Cool. So most of the questions are coming privately to me. So the first one here is, what role have tribal tensions played? Tribal tensions between the Shona and the Ndebele in the factionalism. What role have they played? And I'm guessing that's the factionalism along party lines, along ideological lines, which you spoke about in the history of the military, etc. There's a question about, this is social justice has never been driven by political power, but by civil society. How can we as civil society step up and fight for our brothers and sisters? And I think that's closely related to another question towards the end from Unati, which says, what is the most effective means for us to help without merely grandstanding? We've shared information from activists, we've signed petitions, but is that enough? How do we become more effective? And then, I think let's tackle those for now.
Okay.
We can go
so to go to the tribalism question, Robert Mugabe actually inflamed tribal tensions. Remember what I said to you when you look at the split of ZANU and ZAPU, when actually those two entities when ZAPU split into two, it was led by Ndebele men. It was led by Joshua Nkomo on the one side and Dabaningi Sithole on the other side. And the issue was not a tribal issue at all. So the leadership would change up and down. And in fact, even in 1980, Joshua Nkomo didn't have as many votes as he would have liked because of some of the stuff we've referred to right now. But he had votes across the provinces. He even had votes in Mashonaland. And so did ZANU, but not as much in Matabeleland. So the issues were not tribal. They were just issues of ideology, etc., etc. But obviously, as the war unfolded, Mugabe did fan those tensions, and some of the Zanla forces were of such a aggression that they were trying to also push that agenda. So Mugabe was one of the guys who started creating this tribal divide. And then post-independence, that was increased. Mugabe basically was using a divide and rule, the same strategy that the British were using. So he inflamed historic tensions, created, disproportionate allocation of resources, where he starved off Matabele land and tried to make sure that most of the resources went to Mashona land, and that created a lot of tension. So right now there is some tribal tension. In contrast, people think South Africa has tribal tension, but it really doesn't. Not in the sense that there is tribal tension in Zimbabwe. Sometimes here you'll have a taxi driver, Zulu, whatever, but in Zimbabwe there are people who on principle don't want to speak the other side's language because it's a matter of pride. You must speak mine. So when you're dealing with sales situations, etc. So the tribal tension is a thing. But it's not the thing that really the Zimbabweans on the ground were driving, right? It's not a thing that came organically. It's a thing that was driven at some point, because when the liberation struggle was being fought, even if you think when you go to the first Chimurenga, Muyanehanda did go to Matabele land to lobby forces to say we need to fight the white man. So some of these tensions are a post-independence outcome as a result of the ZANU-PF strategy of divide and rule. But some of them are just, people. There will always be people who are tribal to the point where they dislike the other tribe. That's a thing that does exist, and it exists everywhere. But it's very bad in Zim and not as bad here. But it's far worse in Burundi. So it's a spectrum. In Burundi, in Mali, people are literally killing each other. So in Zimbabwe, there's a tension, but there isn't so much people killing each other as a result of this. There's no civil war as the result of tribes. So there's animosity, but there's not direct conflict. Whereas if you go to Burundi, if you look at that history, Rwanda, you look at Cameroon, you look at Mali, there's real tribal tension in the sense that you can get killed at certain periods of time in certain areas if you're the wrong tribe. Now, going to the second question of what do we do or how do we assist? My recommendation right now would be targeting some of the celebrities with African links, because the African celebrities seem to have jumped on board. I saw Burna Boy was asking for more information. I don't know whether he's received it while we were in this conversation. So he's an interesting figure because he has a lot of European international artists that he knows. And I'm mentioning these people because they help in creating global awareness. Global awareness was important in South Africa when fighting the apartheid regime. It was important in Sudan when they were fighting Omar al-Bashir and the army, and it does help. So I would say like Trevor Noah, David Kibuka, who's from Uganda, they haven't said anything. So maybe to put a little bit more, Zimbabwean Lives Matter hashtags under their tweets, because I mean, Trevor and David are basically doing social justice in America. And if they can educate that American public, then basically ZANU-PF has got nowhere to run, because they need global money for everything. And it's a COVID-19 crisis. Everyone is going out with the begging ball in Africa to ask for money. You can't go to the international community asking for money whilst you're killing your own people. But they need to know that that's what's happening. So I guess that would be one suggestion. But that's a hit or miss. You never know. So, but it does matter, because it was the celebrities coming on board that did create the Zimbabwean Lives Matter moment, because sometimes activists will be tweeting by themselves and it doesn't make a difference. But that solidarity has made a difference. So even though it feels like we've educated everyone, we've told everyone, we still haven't gotten that critical mass where now, we've got like everyone really saying these are the issues and ZANU-PF is exposed properly. But more locally, I do think that the Department of International Trade and Relations, DIRCO, it needs to be lobbied, whether it's through letters, phone calls, whatever the case may be, because Naledi Pandor has not said anything, Minister of International Affairs, and Cyril Ramaphosa right now sits in a very unique position. He is the president of South Africa, the largest trading partner of Zimbabwe, one of the countries which carries the weight of all of the consequences of anything that happens in Zimbabwe, but he's also the chairperson of the African Union right now. And even the theme in the African Union is the theme that says is the time to end, is the year of the year of ending guns, or is the year of silencing the guns. I think that's the formal theme, silencing the guns. So maybe there needs to be more done to lobby, because sometimes you may not be able to get Cyril immediately, but to get people within the ANC ranks, Fikile Mbalula, to get those ones that are active on Twitter. Who else? You've got this girl called Atike Laba. You've got a lot of young ANC people. If we can also get them to start supporting the cause, then organizationally it becomes difficult for the old people to keep saying, no, we're not going to discuss that issue. Some other people, David Masondo, who am I thinking about? Not even David Makura, because they're announcing, they're speaking on COVID, they are coming into the public a lot, so maybe getting them to speak. Figile is always on the internet, so he may be one of the people who may be willing to make that statement. Tony Yengeni is another example of an active ANC member on social media. And then I think starting to do that, and I'll tell you one thing that's interesting. Everyone is very sensitive during COVID-19 period. So I think the ANC has been reading those tweets. They know that they are on short notice right now. And I think Cyril has shown that he can't ignore things that become dominant on social media for too long, because everything is delicate. So you don't want to lose support because you messed up a pandemic. So that's why they're trying to be so responsive, which means that it's a great time to continue trying to lobby those particular people. The other thing I want to say is, I think we need to try to see what we can do to create safe havens or safe houses for anybody who is in real danger. You see, the thing is, people who are commenting on this stuff are not all safe in the same way. So we need to also think about, what do we do for people who either get arrested? How do we get them legal assistance, whether it's through, creating a fund in South Africa and then channeling those monies into Zimbabwe, maybe through London or whatever the case may be. I'm not sure what the dynamics are around this, but activists need to know that if I go outside and I get arrested and I get, shamboked by these cops, that all of the allies in South Africa and the international community are not going to forget me, and I'm not going to disappear. Because the danger with being an activist in Zimbabwe is that if you disappear and no one knows that you've disappeared, if they start asking where you are too many days later, you are not going to reappear. And too many activists have disappeared. There's a guy called Itai Zamara who disappeared, and his brother is still looking for him to this day. And he used to be a vocal anti-government critic. He was a peaceful protester, and most of the times he'd carry a placard, but he disappeared and he's never been seen. And what actually has been reported by some people who used to operate in the military is that they throw people into unused mines. So they'll just throw you into an unused mine and you won't be found for a very long time, unless people are reopening that mine. And there are so many of these unused mines, these mines that are now exhausted and were abandoned, and they've got many holes, many pits. There are many places where you can disappear and never be found again. And this is why being abducted is one of the biggest fears. So you've heard in the reporting, I'm sure, people saying that so-and-so is in hiding. They're in hiding because they're not sure whether or not if they expose themselves, they will disappear.
Yeah. Okay. No, I got you on that one. And I mean, I don't think we would be able to conclusively give all the answers of what might be able to be done in this session tonight. And I'm trying to get as many of the chats as possible into this conversation, because there's a lot that's been spoken about. Pastors do raised a very interesting conundrum here, which is the fact that we are here in our numbers to lend our support to Zimbabweans who are being oppressed in Zimbabwe, but many of us are oppressing Zimbabweans right here in South Africa. We ignore the voices of the vulnerable and exploited Zimbabweans within our very own borders. So that's the first self-checking that we need to do, those of us who are South African in South Africa. The first place you need to check yourself is, how do you start by being supportive to Zimbabweans who are already experiencing some form of oppression in South Africa, not even in their home country. There's a question about whether you think the youth of Zim can mobilize and have a movement similar to the Arab Spring, or has the military instilled so much fear that no one is willing to stand up? Is that possible? And I think you've spoken a lot about that. I mean, just how crippling that the modus operandi is of Zimbabwean intelligence and military in targeting especially the most vocal people, and I mean, making someone vanish into thin air. I mean, that sends chills down anybody's spine. I think you've spoken at length about that. There was a question, a history question. If you could, I don't know if you could wrap this one in 2 minutes about to what extent the Cold War became a factor in the Lancaster House talks and the 1980 election outcome. I'm not sure if that's something you're in a position to speak to very briefly.
So I don't think the Cold War was much of a factor at that particular point, because these guys had now chosen that they were going to pursue a strategy of non-alignment. But really, the relationships were very strong with what am I trying to say? So the affiliations remained the same, but the negotiation process at Lancaster House was not as much affected by the Cold War dynamics, because I don't think that they preferred having a Chinese Maoist in place of a Russian, supporting guy. So either way, it was going to be a country with a socialist flavor. You know what I mean? So those weren't a big issue. In fact, many people actually thought that Tongogara was going to become the president of Zimbabwe. Tongogara was killed a few days after Lancaster House agreements were signed. Because at Lancaster House, he was one of the guys, very supportive, getting along with Nkomo. And it was becoming clear, because he was the highest ranking official and he was the commander of the army, that it's going to be Josiah Tongogara. And as I've said, like 6 days after that thing, he was killed. To speak about some of the stuff about the local treatment of Zimbabweans, I know it wasn't really a question. I think there's really sometimes a even an understanding of the dynamics. Many of the Zimbabweans who are here have what is called a special dispensation visa. I used to do refugee law at Wits Law School, and we used to deal with these kind of things. So Thabo Mbeki and Jacob Zuma tried to make sure that at least they gave a visa to people who were running away, because there was a large group of Zimbabweans who were running away from the political oppression. So the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Home Affairs can actually issue a refugee visa to a group of people. So the special dispensation visa is issued to all of the Zimbabweans who availed themselves to get it. So when you have that special dispensation visa, which is what most of the people have, it allows you to become a refugee, and so that means you can study, all of those things. So the people who are here are not all like illegals, like that Put South Africans First narrative tries to make it seem as if everyone just jumped the border. Most of them are actually on a special dispensation visa, and they are legally in the country. They are known. The special dispensation visa has been renewed. Right, I think the last time they renewed it in 2017 because they recognized that it was still a rough environment. So sometimes some of the narratives that are spread are not fully true, right? When they say that these guys, they're here illegally and they're doing crime. Those kind of narratives, I think that's where we can try to correct. So I want to say something like, I'm aware that there are criminals from Zimbabwe. I'm aware that there are criminals from Zambia, from Nigeria. I'm aware that there are drug syndicates wherein foreign nationals are involved. But I'm also aware that that's not most of the foreign nationals. I'll give you a story from Italy. From America. The Italian community is a 20 million community. The mafia had only 5,000 people at its peak. 5,000 people were involved in the mafia directly. And the community was 20 million. But all of the Italians had to suffer the stigma of being mafia people because of the impact of those 5,000 people. So sometimes we have to ask ourselves, are we having the right conversation when we say these people are doing this? These people, because now you're saying all of them are doing this. Zimbabweans are like this. Nigerians are like this. And it's scary because in some instances, you know, those people's lives become at risk. And I'll tell you, it's not just in the townships where xenophobia can happen. It can happen online, but it can even happen in the suburbs. It can even happen in media where someone is like, ah, no, this foreigner is getting a lot of interviews. Why is this foreigner being asked? And, you know, you don't have to explain yourself to people. You know, I speak all of the languages, you know, and except for Afrikaans, you know, so I navigate slightly differently from the way a Nigerian would, or maybe even a Shona person would in South Africa. But even sometimes I'm exposed to very virulent xenophobia. And I think if we can try to find ways to spread love, right, and try to find ways to correct the conversations which are happening, which are designed around cultivating hate, that also can be a duty that we can discharge, even if it's something that just helps one person, you know, from being attacked or whatever. That's something that can help. And by and large, I think many people don't appreciate that nobody wants to leave their childhood home. Nobody wants to leave the neighborhood where they grew up, the friends that they knew, all of the little spots that they used to enjoy. Nobody wants to leave a space that they built a house in, they put tiles, they did all of that stuff, they bought a new kitchen, all of the things that happen. Just imagine now if you had to leave South Africa and go somewhere, maybe because things just get so hectic, whatever happens, you would miss home. Most people are not trying to become permanent residents. They actually want to go back. But as long as the conditions are so oppressive, they're not able to go back. You know, so even the xenophobe should actually be supporting the people of Zimbabwe so that they can go back quickly. You know, it's in everyone's interest. But even if you can assist just sometimes in helping people on the social media platforms, because some people cannot speak for themselves on social media because then they'll get attacked. And I've noticed that the Put South Africans First accounts, they are anonymous, they are trolls, and it's there's no way to even hold any of those people to account because they're so hidden. And Twitter doesn't even know that this is happening. And maybe we should start thinking about petitioning Twitter to say, Twitter, this is how xenophobia is operating on our platforms in Africa. Please, can you block these hashtags? Please, can you block these kind of keywords? And then maybe we'll see some change, because they're very good at doing that in America, in Europe, but they're very bad at doing it. And even in Myanmar, Twitter and Facebook didn't pick up that there was a lot of hate speech happening on their platforms and people got killed, and they were organizing on Facebook and Facebook didn't even pick up on it because they were posting in different languages, etc. So maybe that's something that we can also think about.
Okay, great stuff, great stuff. There's a contribution that came through here privately about, I mean, what could possibly be done to address this issue. Freeze all ZANU-PF leaders' foreign accounts and ban them from all international travel, because these guys have multi-million dollar accounts outside of Zimbabwe. And the problem is that these guys know their relationships with China and the East are so strong, they will never stop them from traveling to the East. So the greatest move by Zim was to align with the East because they oppose the West ideologically, and ZANU leaders know where their bread is buttered. So that's a contribution there. Trying to find, okay, Candy Moyo has quite a number of questions. I'm not sure we'll be able to tackle all of them. But maybe let's talk about the role of sanctions, because we as South Africans understand that during the apartheid era, one of the mechanisms or instruments from the international community which helped to create pressure, or which helped to exert pressure rather on the apartheid government, was the institution of sanctions. There are certain brands which weren't here for an entire which were there, and then for a block of like 30 odd years, whatever, weren't here in South Africa, like Citroen, for example. Peugeot,
Yeah.
and then just this period of time where it wasn't there because some brands and companies just chose not to align or to supply a country which was involved in a human rights atrocity and such a crime. So what is the role of sanctions? And I mean, there's a sentiment that I'm reading in the chats that sanctions actually hurt the people more than they hurt the government. And what has been interesting is that the AU, instead of speaking out against the human rights abuses, has been more vocal about the sanctions. So I don't understand why they cannot be as vocal about the human rights abuses as they are about the sanctions. So if you can briefly, once again, I'll ask you, Jamie, on the sanctions, and then we tackle something else very quickly.
All right. Okay. So I'll try to be very brief with this one. So number one, the agenda of the AU in opposing sanctions is different from the agenda of any civilian. The AU doesn't like sanctions because the members of the AU recognize that they could also get sanctions. So they have a principal objection to sanctions because they don't want anybody telling them what to do. They have a principal objection to the ICC because they don't want to go to the ICC. So some of the stuff that African leaders will say when they're amongst themselves is not about the civilians. It's just about themselves and protecting their interests. So that's some of the things that are around that. Now, the sanctions debate is very complicated because at some level, when a country is under sanctions, the civilians will be affected. But most of the countries which impose sanctions do provide civil support for the people. So they will give like aid, like the EU, the Americans, they have given aid to Zimbabwe. They have been giving loans to Zimbabwe. Even now under the Mnangagwa regime, there are certain amounts of money that they've received. And I think, was it last year when this sanctions debate came out, a lot of them actually came and said, hey, look, we just gave these guys $500 million US. We don't know what they're talking about because we have these sanctions against individuals and against political operatives. Like right now, America just introduced a sanction on this guy called Tagwire, who's basically is the owner of a company called Sakunda, which has been basically running rampant in the tender fraud. And he has become a very powerful figure in the Mnangagwa regime. He's basically the financier of the Mnangagwa regime. So sanctions have been imposed on him. Obviously, those sanctions will affect the people who work in his company to some extent because now he cannot do the things that he was doing. But it's justified for him to be under sanctions. But that's the tricky part of it because sanctions do exert pressure on an entity. And it's a complicated conversation in that respect. But I do think that to give these guys a Christmas card and remove all sanctions while they continue to be like this will be to reward them for their bad behavior because most of the sanctions directly target them. So now imagine a situation where there are 0 sanctions and 100% oppression. Then how do the people get out of that? Because now it just means that the money can flow internationally. All of the money that has been, did you see what Isabella dos Santos did with the money that she got from Angola? She put it all in foreign bank accounts, and making it easier for an oppressive regime to do that is not, I think, a good idea. But this is now complicated by COVID. We are in COVID right now. There's a pandemic. People need PPE. So I would probably not give Zimbabwe monetary aid, but I would give them the things. I would deliver the PPE. I would deliver the food. I would deliver just not to give them cash, because anything that you give them in cash that comes to a corrupt regime, I think we've seen it across many other countries where people were even telling some other guy, don't contribute that in money, please just buy the PPE and send it, because if you allow us to buy our own PPE, we'll get a quarter of the PPE, and then the 75% will be invoiced. So it's a very complicated situation with sanctions, but they do work, and I think these guys have felt the pressure of the sanctions. Let me put it in context. These guys were determined to bully Zimbabweans on Friday. By Tuesday, the president was announcing publicly to the world, unexpectedly, within 4 days. That shows that they're not in the position of sheer arrogance that they used to be. They know that they are on 0 in the bank account. That's why they are acting in these desperate ways. So it may seem as if the walls of Jericho are not going to fall, but I think we're on day 6 of that process. That's where I think we are.
Preach, sir, preach. No, I hear you. I hear you.
That's where I think we are in that process.
Okay, fantastic. I think we want to create a bit of dialogue, especially for those who are comfortable speaking. So I'm gonna allow Shepherd to come onto the mic and onto the video if he's comfortable with that. And Shepherd, please come in into the conversation. Let's talk.
Yeah, thanks, Boo. I wanted to intervene when Jamie was speaking about the church, and he has touched something interesting again about Takurei. And Jamie might not know this. Takurei is an elder in this church, in the Adventist church, by the way. And the interesting dynamic is the complacency of the Adventist church in Zimbabwe, human rights abuses and economic collapse and violence. If you remember pretty well, we are probably the first institution via Solusi is an Adventist-owned institution to give Robert Mugabe a PhD honorary degree before any other university in Zimbabwe. And this speaks volume of the complacency of the Adventist church. If we're to say a church has to be responsible, we're talking about the Good Samaritan, Jamie. So you are imagining the current situation where an elder of this church is actually the financier of the ZANU-PF regime, to an extent that United States of America put him on sanctions about 5 hours ago today. And they are actually expressing their dismay over his behavior, which we as a church have not done much to do that. And then the other important thing that especially South Africans have to notice or have to know why they need a very good Zimbabwe, functional Zimbabwe, is because of the crime that actually happens through unaudited or through illegal immigrants. For instance, the other day we're driving from a funeral back from a funeral in Zim to South Africa. One guy didn't have his passport and he paid 10 rand at the border to a policeman who was checking the passports. He paid 10 rand and went through. So if you can go through South Africa by 10 rand, you can imagine how many more people can do that. And one important and one critical issue that you have to notice is when somebody commits a crime in South Africa, you cannot get their fingerprints because they were never captured at the border post. This is my last point. There's a research that was done at Vets Migration Studies. It's called Once a Soldier, Always a Soldier. If you Google it, you'll find the article online, where soldiers who flee from the Zimbabwe army and come to South Africa illegally. One of them is actually saying South African police don't even know how to hold guns. For instance, Jamie might attest to this. In Zimbabwe, you'll never see a soldier or a policeman with a gun entering a supermarket or buying lunch or eating in public. They don't do that. You don't see them joking or standing around or even drinking. So what this guy says, a former soldier in Zimbabwe who ran away, of course, came here illegally. And most of the violent crimes, some of them, of course, are conducted by the former Zimbabwean soldiers. He's saying that, you know, South African police are easy to outsmart and they can, you know, they see them as inferior. So South Africa needs a functional Zimbabwe to avoid these kinds of criminals or people who are ejected from Zimbabwe, then they come to South Africa, and the only option they have to survive is through crime. So it's important that I think at a higher level politically, the ANC, Cyril Ramaphosa as the president, has to lean heavily on his Zimbabwean counterpart so that they can actually stop the human rights violations and abuses that are actually happening at that country at this moment.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Shepherd, for that contribution. And I think you raised a very important point in latching on to what Jamie said about the role of the church. But perhaps we need to be clear that CrossOvr is not aligned with any particular denomination. There may be members of the Adventist Church and other denominations on this platform, but we aren't necessarily representative of any denomination whatsoever. But we do definitely take the point that you're making about the role of the church, and broadly, whichever denomination it might be, that we need to be wary and careful of what role it is that we play in either enabling or fighting against the tide of oppression of people, and through corruption and so forth. We need to draw to a close, so I'm going to take not a problem at all, Shepherd. it's fine. We've got there was a question here about who's actually running Zimbabwe right now. Is it the military or is it the president? And that also, I think it links very well with another question, which another comment that I posted, Jamie, where someone said that ZANU-PF is not a political party. They are a paramilitary agency that has been set up to enforce compliance and protect the interests of ZANU-PF. So engaging ZANU-PF as a political party is pointless from that perspective. So if you can take that issue of who's running Zimbabwe, is it the military? What is the role of the military as it relates to the presidency or ZANU-PF as a political party? Let's take that, and then there's one final question which I'll want us to tackle, which will help us, I think, to sum everything up.
Okay. So to answer the question shortly, it seems as if there's a contestation for power still within the ZANU-PF, and I would agree, ZANU-PF is a paramilitary entity. I would agree with that description. Many times I like to call it the ZANU-PF military complex, or I just like to call it a military regime, because I think that's what it is. It's a military regime that performs democracy to make sure that they get some international credibility. It looks like Mnangagwa is still trying to consolidate his own power. You see, when the coup happened, because the military had to come in and give him a lot of the power, it looks as if there's still a lot of contestation within the military. Some people will say it's Chiwenga, who now has been appointed as Minister of Health, even though it's unconstitutional for him to occupy both vice presidency and Minister of Health. But some of it was thought as that it's whenever there seems to be a problem, Chiwenga is brought in because there's still a fear element related to him because of the coup. So it's unclear. It's really some of the ZANU-PF internal politics is just gossip and rumors. It's very difficult to have quality investigative journalism around the party. Like with EFF, you would know this is the Matoro Kisi faction, this is the whatever it was called, I can't even remember now. We knew the factions going into Nasrec. It's more difficult to get quality information on that on ZANU-PF, just because it's dangerous to ask those questions. And the journalists who operate in Zimbabwe, they know how to say enough without saying enough. So they never tell as much as they know, because as soon as they start dishing out secrets, they also go into a prison cell. So I would agree, and that would be my response as to who's running. And there's definitely a contestation, because now the ZANU-PF is in a very, very tight quagmire. And because they are competing with the economy, and they are competing with the democratic frustrations of the people and the constitution, and opposition, which is still trying to take shape. I think they're in a better position than they were before. But if the currency is collapsing, you've got hyperinflation, fuel shortages in the middle of a pandemic, that is what you're also contesting power for. Because every time you try to do bad economics or steal money, it can be acutely felt by everyone. That's why you've got rural teachers are on strike, nurses and doctors are on strike, babies are dying, people are dying at home from COVID-19. All of those things are also a contestation for power. And this is why they are so nervous and delicate.
Okay, all right, no, got that. Just before I hand over to you to wrap up by putting this last question on your lap, which I think will help you to wrap up the session very nicely for us. I think we titled today's discussion Quiet Diplomacy. And I think the importance of that was to basically unpack the nuance of why, and I think you've done that very well, Jamie, helping us to understand why it is that some people aren't able to speak out boldly, and what our role potentially can be. Those of us who do have the privilege and the freedom of speech to be able to lend our voices in support, to be able to do so. And so quiet diplomacy might not necessarily be the way to go. So yeah, we want to encourage everybody, if you have a voice and you have the privilege of freedom of speech, use it to support those who don't have it. That's what you do with privilege. That's why you expect your white friends to be allies in the Black Lives Matter fight, or protests rather, because they have the privilege of the color of their skin, which you do not have. And you expect them to stand in the gap for you. That's why as a male, you have male privilege with which women don't have. You want to stand in the gap for women with that privilege which you have that they don't have. It goes on and on. So it's always very easy, I think, for us to understand it in other contexts, and then when it gets so close to home, we develop some amnesia. So I think that's what we wanted to address basically today, and I hope we've, even to a very small extent, been able to do that. So this is the question that I want to give to you. It's a very impassioned and personal question, Jamie, which you can answer to help us wrap this up. So, do you believe that it's possible for things to change in Zimbabwe? Many people there have essentially given up, and even Christians will tell you that things will only change when Christ returns. And even our parents' generation will tell you that the change we're fighting for is driven by the opposition party, fueled by whites. It certainly feels like a lot stacked up against us. Can we break through? So if you can wrap up for us by answering that, Jamie.
Okay, so I'm a Christian, so I always believe that you have a chance to win. And in fact, I always tell people that I'm a pragmatic optimist. So I always try to be realistic about the conditions on the ground, but I always believe that you still have space to win. But I always think that also God is, I don't know if this will get me into a bad book somewhere, but I think that God loves drama, because he doesn't come to save people when it's convenient. You know, God could have killed Goliath on day one, but he wanted David to come and do it with a stone to show how great he was.
Yeah.
Because I think that's just the way God rolls. And if you think of many different stories in the Bible, you're like, you don't have to wait till the last minute to tell Moses to part the ocean, but he wanted the spectacle so that he could show his glory and stuff.
Preach, sir, preach.
I think, you know, for me, I always reserve that optimism. You never know. You know, many people didn't even think Mugabe could step down. And when I look at this particular situation, I see a government that is actually not as strong as they pretend to be. I think what we're seeing is that, I mean, when has this ever happened that South African celebrities, they don't even care about politics, but all of a sudden, all of them now understand that Zimbabwean lives matter.
Yeah.
I've never seen that. I've never seen a situation where Musi Maimane, Julius Malema, and several other political leaders can agree on a point like this. You know, one is saying, oh, close the embassy. Another is saying, I want you to someone. I've never seen that. I've never seen Gabrielle Union speaking up on behalf of Zimbabweans. I've never even seen her speak up on behalf of anything in SADC. You know, but all of a sudden, I think we're entering this moment where Africa is actually on the ascendant. And maybe it's today, maybe it's tomorrow, maybe it isn't. But you never know as a Christian, right? You throw your stone and you never know, right? Because sometimes it's not your portion for that thing to happen. But I think for me, I actually believe that it's going to happen. And I think that we must die trying, you know? And, you know, there's a scripture somewhere, I'm very bad with verses and stuff, but it says God is not a respecter of persons, but principles, right? So if you think about a person like 50 Cent, 50 Cent had faith to get rich. He said, I'm going to get rich or I'm going to die trying. Now, there's a lot that's wrong in that man's life, but he is rich. He did get that. He walked in the faith of getting rich. So I think that we have to have that same level of zealous commitment to some of the causes that we fight for justice for. Say, let's help these people or die trying. And I don't think it's a physical death, but we must at least die of exhaustion. We must die of shouting into the room of people who are not listening to us. We must die of repeating ourselves over and over again. To say, hey, I have to keep repeating myself on Twitter about this thing, but I'm going to die trying. And not necessarily give up. So that's where I stand. But I do think that we are closer than we've ever been. Like I said, I think we're on day 6 of marching around the walls of Jericho. And I do think that we're entering an African epoch. I think that, you know, there are some prophecies and some stuff around Africa. You know, there's a song that I used to listen to as a kid by a lady called Mai Charamba, and she used to say, Africa, whose report are you going to believe? And I think it's in the Bible somewhere, that question. And I think we have to ask ourselves, whose report are we going to believe as we get onto these platforms, as we try to advocate for social justice, not only for Zimbabweans, but for all of the issues that are affecting Africa. We have to believe that there is a God so mighty, even in the presence of all of this COVID-19, whatever the case may be, that this post-COVID-19 period is one which is going to be more powerful. I think my final words are going to be that there's a sermon that T.D. Jakes preaches quite a few times, or rather that I listen to a lot. And he quotes a scripture which says that all of creation is awaiting the manifestation of the sons and daughters of Christ. And the world keeps looking for the manifestation of a new leader. The world keeps looking for, you know, a new moment, a new gadget, a new technological development. But all of creation groaneth in anticipation of the manifestations of the sons and daughters of Christ. I think that if we walk and we manifest what the scriptures say about us, about what we are capable of doing, it's never in friendly conditions. I don't think that David ever had a relaxed battle, but the manifestation is a walk in faith in the face of giants, in the face of brutal dictators, in the face of people who say that they're going to flush out bad apples, and you can still tweet, no, Zimbabwean lives matter. Zimbabwean's life, and to not get fatigued in doing it. You know, so that would be my answer, as I still maintain that optimism. And I'm hoping that God is in the dressing room putting on the makeup now for the final performance, because I've seen that he loves drama. So maybe this is the moment where he comes out and we finally see that massive moment for SADC, for Africa.
Jamie, the next time we invite you to CrossOvr, we want you to come and preach a sermon, because really you have an underutilized gift of dishing out the word, man. That's a word you've got right there. So thank you so much, Jamie. We cannot thank you enough. It's very difficult to find speakers on this topic for obvious reasons, especially speakers who can speak so knowledgeably and give of themselves and their knowledge. So thank you so much for availing yourself to CrossOvr, and we hope we can engage with you further when we want to learn more on this particular topic. So may you be blessed.
Thank you for having me.
May God richly bless you. And as you can see, I think you'll get a chance to look into the chats right now and see that the CrossOvr community has been very blessed by what you've shared with us today. So
thank you everyone. Thank you, I appreciate it. I do see the comments. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Great. So we'll have music playing out in a few moments. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today. So we'll see you again on Friday. There's a word that's been prepared for you, and look out on our social media for who the speaker will be and what the topic will be. It will always be exciting. You know, this is CrossOvr. So good night, everybody. See you on Friday.
This land, our land, is our Zimbabwe, a land of peace for you and me, once born in pain and segregation, but now we live in harmony. Now flies the flag, our nation's glory. We live with pride inside our hearts. and space may separate us, and yet she holds my heart alone. Now flies the flag, my nation's glory. I live with pride inside my heart. I'll make a stand to build this nation, this my land, my Zimbabwe. Now flies the flag, our nation's glory. We live with pride inside our hearts as we all stand to build our nation, this our land, our Zimbabwe. We've been through it all. We've had our days, we've had our falls. Now the time has come for us to stand as one. The night is gone, and with the morning come rays of hope that lead us on. So we will strive to give our children a brighter day where they belong. Oh,